Okay, so I have to be careful what I'm saying. Shall I start, Natasha?
Please go ahead whenever you're
ready. Okay, all back. Thank you very much, Natasha, for this excellent introduction. My name is René van Horik. I work for Dans KNW. I'm a partner. I work in the Fair Impact Project and in the work package on persistent identifiers. Well, what we try to do is to make, that's the project says, to have that the FAIR principles have more impact in the research world. And of course, persistent identifiers are a very important component of this. In this presentation, before the break, there will be two parts. The first, I would like to start with a kind of an introduction, and then my colleague Wim Hugo will take over and will tell you more about a compliance assessment methodology and related topics of PIDs. And so that is what, and okay, now I go. Yeah, so what I would like to do is three things. First of all, elaborate a little bit on the research life cycle and workflow. It's a little bit obvious, but of course, PIDs are an important means to play a role in the life cycle of data in the research world. And the second part, we will look into that in more detail. And I would like to introduce the compliance assessment of PID policies. For me, as it is a quite abstract issue, and we start with an introduction in this part of the presentation, and Wim Hugo will elaborate on it after my presentation. I think most of you must be familiar with these or more models of the data life cycle, from planning to collecting, processing, publishing, preserving, and reusing data coming from the data archiving community. The second life cycle model has its basis in the life and the curation world, the Digital Creation Center. And it's clear that it's important in order to replicate research or to reuse data that we create a kind of chain, and that these phases are following up, and that's the main point here, that PIDs can act as a kind of glue for the components of the chain, because that it enables us to make things unique, identifiable, and that we don't have the risk that further on in the chain things get messed up. At least that's the idea. People with the same name but different persons, etc. I think you will understand the rationale of and the value of PIDs in this respect. Well, and then the next thing, and I built upon also the introduction of Natasha. What kind of entities do we see in our world? That is, of course, researchers. It's all human. It starts with researchers. They do projects where data are created or reused. Results are published. Also unimportant, of course, is the funding of everything by research councils and the EU, for instance. Instruments are used to create data. Software, obvious as well. There will be a breakout session dedicated to a specific this entity, etc., etc. So there's a whole discussion going on what kind of entities we can see in the research workflow. And going back to this glue, the PIDs are the glue in the data lifecycle. And I said, for researchers, for instance, we have an ORCID. There are more There's also ISNI, and now we go into all these acronyms, but I only mention one. For projects, for instance, we can use the rate. For data, we can, for instance, use the handle. For publications, a digital object identifier. For funders, ROR. Instruments, there is also an initiative called PID-INST. And for software, the software identifier. And again, if you would like to know more about it, you can attend one of the breakouts later today, etc., etc. It's not the aim of this presentation to come up with an overview of all these entities and all possible PIDs. And maybe you remember the slide of Natasha, because she has a much more impressive slide with much more PIDs and entities. And the slides will become available, so you can look at that and see what's going. Yeah, see also other PIDs and entities in our community. Well, what's the benefit of all? This slide is also hopefully being a good argument to use position identifiers, because with the PID you can create relations between research objects. The researcher can be connected to his or her publication that is made available by a grant. The researcher is working for an organization, creates and uses data. And researchgraph.org is an initiative to implement this model and to connect a graph of all these components in the research world. There are more initiatives, but I wanted to show this as an introduction. I think concerning the workflow and a PID workflow and data cycle, I also have to mention the very excellent work done by the More Brains initiative. And if you go to their website, you can, there's an interactive animation, and starting with getting funding on the left side, using doing the research, doing the analysis, storing it. And then in the middle, you see PIDs and registry. It says priority PIDs and registries, because there are more. But that's a very excellent example of a working ecosystem, workflow often used in the research world. The next slide is also, it's very textual, but it gives you first of all the link to this to these excellent workflows. They are also giving us an interactive workflow for research management, for funding, for data, and for the publication. And the following PIDs were selected: the Crossref DOI, the ORCID for people, I already mentioned them, the RATE for projects, Research Organization Registry, and again, Crossref and DataCite DOIs for articles and data. Okay, so I really recommend to take a look at it, and I just want to mention them here briefly. But now we have to step one. I would like to do one step back, because we now have a nice overview of existing services and PID schemes and organizations and initiatives and managers, etc. But of course, everything starts with the policy. So you have to think about some principles according for a service or a PID scheme in order to build an infrastructure. And then, of course, the question could be, what requirements do we want? Which criteria do we apply? And who are the stakeholders in our system? Who should we get involved in this? And what about the governance? What about the long-term perspective? Of course, it's so obvious. You can set up an excellent PID service, but if you go bankrupt next year, it's not really persistent. Talking about how to finance everything. So I think that this is a step back, because you have to agree on these policy issues in order to start building and rolling out and the PID infrastructure. And this is of course, and this is also to assess PID policies and to find a method to determine the compliance with requirements is something we will take a detailed look on further on in this workshop. But before I would like you to give us, if you were asked the question, which criteria would you apply when assessing the features of a PID? I mean, and then of course you, as I don't know, if you are a researcher, then you probably have other criteria than if you are a service provider, or when you are a funder or a policymaker for research. So as there are many PID systems, there are also many systems to gather reactions from the crowd. I would like to ask you to go to the slido.com website and enter the code 1045483, because that will not surprise you. Then you could give us some thoughts about what you think would be the criteria that are important when you use or create a PID. And this is also done because when this is also gives you us an indication what you think could be possible. Could you add the link in the chat? Yeah, can I do that? Then I have to this.
Renee, it's in the chat now.
Okay, already also the
link is there.
There is also a direct link. I get a little bit nervous now because now I have to go to this present. Very good. So we got somebody who says sustainability is important, community adaptation, long discoverability, long-term persistence, metadata completeness. So, okay, this is interesting. So it's not the PID, but also the related metadata that is an issue. And please do add as much as possible. Okay, so how can I now? Oh yeah, I can. Can you see also the results? Or not? Can you see the results?
Yes, now it's perfectly fine. Yes, we can.
Okay, so now shall I play some music or I don't know. Yeah, this is important for us because for all of us to get an idea of what you think is which important criteria are relevant for you. So I see, of course, long-term persistence. That means that you have to have a thorough business model. I'm also looking at the clock. Oh, yeah, I still have time. Yeah. 8 new responses. So let's globally unique. Yeah, of course. That's sustainability. Should be free, machine readable. Sustainability, easy to set up, for instance, not from Microsoft and other, yeah. Persistency, sustainability, resolvability, uniqueness, cost, community preference, yeah. The whole shebang, catered for long-term preservation, reliable, certified by a trustworthy agency, non-commercial, easy usable, easy generation, governance, cost. You mean it should be free, probably. Sustainability, metadata completeness, I also saw them. When broken, should give good explanation what happened. Okay, yeah. When broken, you mean it's not resolvable anymore, or it's often what we see is that a tombstone there should be there that explains that still the metadata is there and explains why the PID does not resolve to the content anymore. I think this is a very good input from you, and it's all in natural language, so it's fuzzy, and we can of course cluster it and to categories. And again, this is also something that we will look upon later on, because then, especially, and Wim will go into detail. A model is introduced with attempts to harmonize all issues in relation to a PID infrastructure. And I see something in the chat from Baptiste Cecchioni, a general comment. I won't be able to. So my experience with data citation is difficult to set up. Guideline and open data often in place, but actual citation of data is only set up in HTML and PDF version, but not in Crossref metadata. So it's okay for a human reader, but it can be used for building SKG. How can we force the editors to actually implement data citation down to the Crossref metadata? Okay. This question is I think I cannot answer. So this is very specific, but maybe some of the experts in the workshop, we keep an eye on it, and maybe some of us can come back to it. But yeah, we will keep this on the radar, definitely. It's human reader, but not just, yeah, it's very specific for me, I have to admit. Okay, I think we have quite a lot of input from you, and thank you very much. So this is also a kind of bridge to the second part of my my introduction. Let me see. So now I go to slideshow again. Okay, thank you very much. So we, yeah, Wim answers difficult to enforce, but there are efforts now in Verco for EOSC and existing efforts, Skull Exploit, to maintain the links. Not ideal, but the situation is improving. But one can also use our row crate to document the relations. I hope that this is some answer for you, Baptiste. And if you don't mind, I will continue. Okay, so we are now convinced of the importance of the PID as a glue in the PID work data cycle and workflow. We now are going to focus more on compliance assessment between records of PID policies. And the model and method for this is developed by the Verco for EOSC project. But the Fair Impact project has the task to be the messenger, the piano player, more or less. We try to evaluate and support this method. This method is all still a work in progress, and there are services under development, in development. And but this workshop is a very important event to start with this impact exercise. And everything starts, of course, with the specification, and that is a quite extensive document. It's deliverable 2.1 of the Verco for EOSC project. It is published in Zenodo, and what I did here is put a link behind and hyperlink. So I don't know what we can do to maybe in the chat to put the persistent identifier to Zenodo to this specification. But you will have, of course, the opportunity, or put it in the notes, because then you also have access to the specification. Based on this specification, currently a system is under development. It's called the CAT, the Compliance Assessment Toolkit. Will be mentioned later on as well, I suppose, by some introduced by Wim. And so the Compliance Assessment Toolkit is, as what it says, it is a software system to assess the compliance according to quality standards of a policy. And in the future, any more policies will be included, but currently the first exercise, first use case is focused on compliance assessment of the already mentioned EOSC PID policy. So Natasha already gave us some information on that. The EOSC PID policy is published in 2020 by the EOSC PID implementation and task force. And the next presentation by Wim will go more into detail. So this is the context of the compliance assessment. Created by the Vercor for EOSC project. They do the development work. Fair Impact is tasked with evaluation and support. The specification is available as a deliverable. Based on the specification, software is developed. A use case is currently analyzed by this specification. It's the EOSC PID policy. And now you are curious, but you have to wait for the next presentation to go into detail. But I would like to have an attempt to do a short introduction on that. So first of all, and this is a very important, would say, model. This comes, it will not surprise you. This model is an extended, updated version of a model that you can find in the compliance assessment specification. Thank you. Here you have the Zenodo link. And it is also in another way already introduced by Natasha. She also had a slide with the PID owner and PID manager and the PID authority. And this model, the scheme is where it there are a couple of entities that we will focus on, and that will be the PID scheme. And that is that gives the rules of the PID, the prefix and suffix details, for instance. And then an authority is using a PID scheme to provide metadata and object to an owner, for instance, the DOI.org organization. And then there is a service provider, for instance, DataSite. And then there is the PID manager. And for instance, DANS, where I work for, we manage PIDs by using PID services to give data sets in our repository a PID. And then these are the most important entities we will look to. But Wim will come back to this model, I think. Okay, so this is the compliance assessment specification, the model, the ecosystem. You could also say that the PID ecosystem, quite abstract, but it tries to harmonize the aspects of all kinds of entities that are relevant in the PID infrastructure. And now we go to the, as I said, we have the specification, and now we have the case study. And the case study of the EOSC PID policy starts on page 58 of the compliance assessment specification. And now you see a quite impressive list of things here. You see there are 10 principles and objectives discovered in the PID policy that have a relation with 35 criteria. think back to the criteria we just entered in the Slido about it should be long-term persistent and globally usable. It will not surprise you. They will come back in these 35 criteria. And now we are going to apply these to the 5 actors of the ecosystem: scheme, authority, service, manager, and owner. But a criteria also has to be tested. So there are also 35 tests, and there are 35 guidance statements in this specification, starting on page 58. But for human being, this is quite a heavy stuff to digest. So we have the CAT, the Compliance Assessment Toolkit, will help us with that. That is important to keep in mind. But I would like to try, and I hope I will, I never know will I succeed, but to explain a little bit more how this works. So let's start with the principles. So let's see. So for instance, the first, so you said there are 10 principles. Here are the first 4. And the first principle is the PID application depends on unambiguous ownership, proper maintenance, and unambiguous identification of the entity being referenced. Okay, we all recognize that here it says it should be unique and have and will be available for the long term. We all agree this is a very important principle or objective. It has to be secure. Granularity, principle 4. That you can make a distinction between different levels of an object, give that level an individual identifier, etc. So this is only as an illustration. So keep in mind, so for instance, if you go at principle 1, application, there is then also criteria 1 related to this application. So it says, a service should provide a common an API to interact with PID, supporting a minimum set of operation. It should, it's not enforced. It would be great to have it. But there are also things that say, for instance, go to criteria 3, PID ownership must be visible. So here you see already that some of the, now the principles are translated in criteria that are more strict. And they also are, some of them are a go or no go criteria. If the PID ownership is not visible to other actors in the ecosystem, it will not pass the compliance assessment because it must do this. Also, the criteria number 5, the PID manager must provide the functionality required to main PID attributes. If not, it will not pass the compliance assessment. And then you see also that in the benchmark that it says with accessibility, the musts are binary, yes or no. Okay, so again, so we have 10 principles. We have 35 criteria. The first 5 are here, there, etc. It's undoable, of course, to go through all of them. But I hope that you see the relation between the principle and the criteria. And the next thing is, of course, and now I come back to this ecosystem, these criteria are of course not applicable to all actors. And for now, I would like, and again, given the time and also it's impossible, I think, for a human being to digest this complete table. It also says, etc. Well, let's focus on the actor of manager. And here again, you see, here you see criteria number 5 that has, so the manager must comply with the update functionality. It should transfer ownership as a criterion, and it must provide resolution integrity. Okay, so that is coming out of the analysis. That is the analysis of the PID policy according to the appliance assessment, etc. Again, this is a quite extensive table. again, it's not my intention to explain all the content of this table, but the principle. So you start with an objective, then we have a criteria, and the criteria applies to an actor, manager. And now again, a very impressive table. Again, don't look to the other actors, but again, in the red box, you will recognize the go no go aspect, and you will also see that means that if the manager does not meet criteria number 5, then that means that the PID policy, that the manager will not meet the PID policy requirements according to the assessment policy. And then there is also there are also criteria that have a may and should, and it's always good if the manager meets all 6 of them, but if not, it just helps you to rank. So the more the best, but if not, it's still not a stopper for being compliant. Okay, are you still with me? So it's the principle, the criteria related to an actor, and then with an aspect of ranking or go or no go. And to finish this exercise, you're all curious, which are these 6 criteria? Well, here they are. Criteria 5 is the PID manager must provide functionality required to maintain PID attributes. The PID manager must maintain the integrity of the relationship between entities and their PIDs in conformance to a PID scheme defined by a PID authority. That's 7, and then we go. Criteria 14, a PID manager must ensure the entity remains linked to the PID. Here we go with this. That was also something mentioned in the Slido. What happens if the link is broken? In case that the entity is being identified, is deleted or ceases to exist, a tombstone information needs to be included in the PID attribute set. Okay, it's good. We already met one of the remarks given by participants in this workshop, maybe more. Physical, this is criteria number 16. Physical and conceptual entities must be represented via a digital representation, for instance, a landing page, metadata, attribute set, database index, to have a presence in the digital landscape. We're almost there. The PID service must maintain entity metadata as accurately as possible in collaboration with the PID owner. This copy is the authoritative version. And the last one is for the manager, the criteria that has a go or no go aspect. The basic service of PID registration and resolution shall have no cost. Oh, it should be free. It must be free. But that's how a Dutch person would say it. But now, this is more shall not have costs is also more decent to say. I do not give the ranking criteria. That would be boring, and also this is already a challenge. But Dans is a PID manager where I work for, so it means that we have to comply to these 1, 2, 3, 6 criteria in order to be compliant with the EOSC PID policy. And okay, so that is 5 more minutes for me, but I hope this is just the first. So I hope that going from the principle to this proposed assessment per actor in a quite fast way gives you an indication of the methodology behind the compliance assessment. and I only was able to address a small number of principles and criteria. And we will go dive into more detail. Wim will go take over now, because it will not. He is very important in setting up this this model and methodology. So I'm grateful to Wim for that. I only have a minor role. I try to have a role in the explanation and dissemination of it, and also be critical sometimes. But you also could do that, and you have the opportunity to do that also, to join us in the breakout later on, where we go more into detail into it. But are there any? So I think that this is my last slide. You see, this is the last slide. Gives you an overview of all the partners in the Fair Impact. Not very relevant here, but it's a nice last slide. But so I still have. Is there anything that somebody urgently wants to complain or ask or say to me? Otherwise, we go to I give the floor to Wim, and I hope that it gives you a more or less a brief introduction of the compliance assessment. Okay, if I also, let's look at the chat as well. So in that case, okay, I see another point. Do you actually deal with? Okay, I see quite some remarks. Yeah. The repos of science. And Wim already reacted on it. So I suggest, is that okay that you take over, Wim? Did I forget something? I probably said something wrong, so you have the opportunity to set it right here now.
No, all good. Thanks, René.
Okay. So I stop sharing now and say goodbye. And yep, have a nice further workshop for all of us. Yeah.
Yeah, let me try and share my screen. I hope you can all see the screen.
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much. Thanks, René. My name is Wim Hugo. I'm also from Dans and involved in both FAIR Core for EOSC and in FAIR Impact in developments around persistent identifiers, improving its use and the quality of its implementation, I think would be a good summary. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on a number of concepts, and then we're going to look at the criteria that apply to managers of persistent identifiers in a bit more detail. And I'll also give you a quick overview of the compliance assessment toolkit that is being developed by FAIR Core for EOSC. So the first thing to consider is the process and where we are in that process currently. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the EOSC PID policy, which was published in 2020 and that Natasha has reviewed for us. And in the FAIR Core for EOSC project, the specification that René has just summarized was an attempt to structure that policy in a way that makes it more measurable, and to reformulate the criteria that are implicit in the policy in such a way that it is clear which of the actors in the ecosystem are responsible for its implementation, and whether it's mandatory or not. So René gave us a good overview of the outputs there. There is one or two criteria that we've identified already during the FAIR Core for EOSC assessment of the policy that we asked the task force to consider for addition. And these are actually, from my perspective, quite important. They relate directly to measurable and publicly verifiable records of persistence and resolvability. Because we have claims in the public domain, in essence, that these persistent identifiers are persistent and resolvable, amongst other things, but we actually don't have any significant proof that it is the case. And there are many studies now that indicate that we are somewhat foolish to believe that persistent identifiers will be resolvable forever and a day. That's certainly not the case in practice, but more about that a little bit later. And then we are in this point of the process at the moment where we are engaging with the community. And that's actually also very important because the community has expectations. Renee has asked a little bit about that, and we will put more effort into it in the near future. We are identifying the use cases and the workflows and existing PID policies and best practices that are available in the literature and from engagements with the user community, because our thesis, at least, is that the EOSC PID policy is not covering all of the use cases necessarily that the community is interested in. And that's quite important because it may be adequate, but there's also no proof that it is the case. So we are double checking that the EOSC PID policy covers a reasonably large proportion of the use cases and the PID services that the user community is interested in using. So we're saying that it might not be true, and we are using the opportunity in Fair Impact to investigate whether this is indeed the case. So it might be that we add yet some more criterion principles to the EOSC PID policy and feed that back to the task force for consideration in the next version of the policy. We've also developed some placeholder guidance in the Fair Core for EOSC project, but we need to elaborate that and solidify it quite a bit by looking at the best practices that we identify in this phase of the work. And then if we are successful towards the end of the Fair Impact and Fair Core for EOSC projects, we would hope to have a solidified EOSC PID policy together with some of the suggestions for extension incorporated into it, linked to a knowledge base about the PID landscape that we are also developing behind the scenes in Fair Impact, including some best practices that could guide actors in the ecosystem towards improved quality of service, and then also providing some testing services for, amongst other things, aspects such as resolvability or persistence. So that's the broad context of the process that we are busy with. Okay, the second thing to highlight quickly is this concept of what we call PID stacks. Now, if you look at the ecosystem model that Renee has spoken about, we have all of these different actors such as authorities and maintainers of the schemes, standards bodies, users, providers or agencies, managers and owners and so on. But different parts of this ecosystem all need to function properly for a PID stack to be successful. And some of the PID stacks are very simple. You can go directly to a service provider as an owner and request a persistent identifier, and that would be it. But many of the others, and especially the DOI-based systems that are ultimately derived from the handle system, many of those are very complex in the sense that there are multiple actors in the ecosystem that all have to do a good job and comply with policies or best practices for the PID stack to be viable. So we're investigating this in a great degree of detail and incorporating all of these different stack definitions, as it were, into the knowledge base together with as much information as we can identify about them. So it's important to understand, for instance, that Crossref and DataCite look like different persistent identifiers, and they are, of course, but higher up in the stack, they are exactly the same because they are managed via the DOI Foundation, the Donor Foundation as the authority, and they're ultimately all based on the handle system. Similarly, EPIC has got a role in the ecosystem, for instance, similar to the DOI Foundation, and then they have a number of provider or registration agencies that we haven't listed in this table that are similar, for instance, to Crossref or DataCite. Okay. I'm not sure why this is now. Oh, sorry, I clicked on a link. Okay, so if we then start looking at best practices for managers of persistent identifier services, we start, of course, with the EOSC PID policy, because one could argue that each of those 35 criteria that we've identified reflects an action that can be equated to some kind of a best practice. But we are also, as we said, gathering quite a bit of information from the community, and that information must assist us to develop additions to the best practices that we have identified in the EOSC PID policy. So we are creating two sets of data in a large knowledge base behind the scenes. The one is one that we call the elements, characteristics, and attributes of PID stacks. So those are documented from the perspective of end users, but it takes into account the characteristics and features and performance attributes that have already been identified in the EOSC PID policy. And I'm just going to quickly, maybe I shouldn't click on it because we might run out of time, but we'll have a look at what this means in one of the following slides. And then in parallel, we are also developing the reasons why people would want persistent identifiers. And Rene has mentioned this in his presentation. We are looking at the workflows and the use cases and the elements of those use cases where persistent identifiers might be used. And we are trying to determine what the benefits are to the end users for incorporating persistent identifiers at given points in these workflows. I think this is quite important because one of the, let's say, I wouldn't call it a deficiency, but one of the things to understand about the EOSC PID policy is that it is quite narrow in scope. It sort of deals with the mainstream persistent identifiers that we can all name off the top of our heads, such as ORCIDs and DOIs and RORs and so on. But it doesn't dive very deeply into what is a very large collection of persistent identifiers that are used quite widely in the scientific and research world to identify especially things like concepts. If you think about all the URIs that are pointing to vocabulary concepts and so on, there are millions or tens of millions, hundreds of millions of these things. And these are not, in my view, at the moment, very well handled within the EOSC PID policy. So we're looking much more broadly than the EOSC PID policy at this current point in time to build up this knowledge base. And then from there, we hope to derive a definitive or a more authoritative set of best practices for the actors in the ecosystem, the authorities, the agencies, the managers, and the owners. And this, of course, can be used to develop both institutional and national policies in respect of persistent identifier use. And those will then align in all probability quite well with the EOSC PID policy. So as I said, the policy focuses on these mainstream object referencing identifiers, but there are many other use cases that does not necessarily use only the kinds of identifiers that the policy was written for. So the elements, characteristics, and attributes of PID stacks, this is a high-level view of what's essentially a mind map or graph-like structure that contains all kinds of requirements or expectations from the community. But in broad terms, one could say that they deal with functionality, with a type of service topology, the cost, a definition, what is done in terms of mitigation of the typical problems that one encounters, and then what kind of performance one expects from the providers of PID services. And the functionality, again, the usual suspects are in there, such as persistence and resolvability and uniqueness, but there are also quite a few others. And then I've just also expanded performance to the next level to indicate that it deals with things like governance and sustainability and what kind of value addition one could get from those services and what kind of availability and service levels one, amongst other things, expect from them. And this goes into quite a bit of detail. It now links to over 150 literature references for indications of what community expectations and current practices entail. Just a further note is that the ones, as you dive deeper into this, the live version is under a link here, is as you dive deeper into this by double-clicking on the nodes, the ones in blue are also referred to in the EOSC PID policy. And then the ones that are in yellow come from something called POSI, the Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure. And that's quite influential, I would say, in defining the expectations of the community from the providers of these open services, such as PID services. So that's the kind of work that we are doing within the Fair Impact project. Now, Renee looked at the criteria already, but I'm summarizing them here again from the perspective of PID managers. So they refer to things such as attribute, maintenance, update functionality, the ability to transfer ownership, resolution integrity, and so on. And then on the next page, the balance of them, together with at the bottom there, the two criteria that we have proposed to the task force to include that deal directly with measurable persistence and resolution. And it's important to note that persistence and resolution looks different depending on what scope you measure it for. If we measure it for a manager, it will look quite different compared to measuring it across all the different managers that are served by a specific multi-provider authority, or by a certain authority. So we need to also make sure that we measure these persistence and resolution metrics with the appropriate scope and with large enough samples to be believable. So one of the sources of best practices, and we'll go into that in quite a bit more detail in our breakout session, as it applies to managers, are these elements or criteria that come from the PID policy. But I would like to also then focus on 3 or 4 specific best practices that I've consolidated from these criteria and from literature. And the first sort of covers one of the questions that was raised early on in our workshop in respect of persistence and uniqueness and resolution. And the main expectations are actually 4 different things, that identifiers should be unique, persistent, resolvable, and that they must be global. And as you can see in the bottom right of the slide, not all identifiers cover all the bases equally. So some of them are, in the true sense of it, globally unique, persistent, and resolvable, but many of them are not, because they are only unique within a specific namespace, or, as is the case, a very good example of typical web URLs in things like DBpedia or GitHub, they are unique and global and resolvable, but there is no guarantee that they will be persistent. So one has to match the requirements that you have in respect of these 4 distinct elements with the use case that you have. And in some cases, not being persistent might be adequate, whereas in other cases, it should be persistent and resolvable and unique, but it's not that important that it is globally available. So there's nuances in this idea of persistent identifiers and how it matches with the use cases that one wants to satisfy. The second aspect to look at is the management of persistence. There's a lot of literature about this by now. I'm just citing an example that is a little bit older, but interesting because of the mechanisms that were used to evaluate persistence and resolvability, which I think is very good and will provide an input for the tests that we are busy developing in FAIRcore for EOSC. And there's basically 2 issues. The one is a failure to resolve, but then once a persistent identifier has resolved, it may not be pointing to the content that it originally pointed to. And this is, of course, quite difficult to establish. And in some cases, that content drift is by design. But in other cases, it's disastrous if there is content drift. So again, the extent to which persistence and resolvability is implemented very much depends on the use case. If you are interested in the evolution of an object over time as a digital historian, then having specific identifiers for each instance or manifestation of an object or concept over time is very important. But if you're just looking for the latest data set, then the previous versions may not be of so much interest to you. So all of these things are, to a large extent, use case dependent, and one needs to select the most appropriate persistent identifiers based on that consideration too. The other important part is that the persistence element of persistent identifiers takes effort. There is no persistent identifier that will remain persistent and resolvable without effort, and that effort costs money. So while we are quite correct to insist that it's free to the end user, the cost of the persistent identifier ecosystem needs to be borne somewhere. And from my perspective, at least, it's a lot better to pay for something where you know what kind of service level you can expect in return than to have a service where the costs are sort of hidden and obfuscated without any clear indication of what can be expected in return for that payment. Okay, then the other very important practice for PID managers has to do with versioning. And again, versioning is not a single concept. There are all kinds of nuances depending on the intentions that you have and the use case that you are trying to satisfy. And I've listed 4 different variations on the theme in the slide that you can look at, because as how you handle versioning is largely dictated by the situation that you are trying to address. Earlier on, there was a mention about why one would want these persistent identifiers in all cases. And for me, reproducibility is one of the big arguments for saying that one should reliably be able to always identify and find the exact outputs and inputs in the scientific process. And that, I think, is one of the most basic motivations for persistent identifiers. Then, things that managers should consider, best practices, is to become involved as a stakeholder in the governance structures, both technical and social, in these PID services, because opportunities to do so exist. So that would be a very good thing to do. And then there's also an additional checklist that we're adding of other things that managers should expect from the other actors in the ecosystem, such as certification and compliance, statements of continuity and planning to be able to guarantee continuity, sustainability from a financial, technical, and social perspective, clear definition of responsibilities of the actors, and then to what extent they also provide value-added services. So in the remaining time, I hope there's still a minute or two, Natasha.
Yeah, you're well on time.
Yeah, okay. So with that, all of that in mind, maybe then just a quick look at the PID policy compliance toolkit that we are developing in Faircore for EOSC. And the value of compliance with a policy is also different depending on which actor you are in the ecosystem. And for authorities and providers, those are the likes of DataSite, Crossref, ORCID, the Donor Foundation, the DOI Foundation, the sort of deeper levels of the stack, if you could call it that. We are going to engage with them in the sense that all assessments are initially self-assessments. So they have to indicate publicly to what extent they comply with the PID policy. Although the PID policy envisages some form of a compliance authority in the future. And I think it's very important from the perspective of the end users and the managers and the owners of persistent identifiers for these actors in the ecosystem to confirm publicly to what extent they comply. Most of the mainstream PID services from informal checking will comply, but there are many other persistent identifier services that one could argue are not so mainstream that will likely not comply. And that is also something to feed back to the task force in the sense that potentially for different use cases, not all of the criteria might be equally important or have the same weight. And that, of course, is a refinement that one could look at further down the line. And then for managers, we would argue that optional disclosure of policy compliance for purposes of trust and community acceptance would be quite important. We don't think that there's any obligation on managers to publish their self-assessment. They can do it solely for the purpose of confirming to what extent they must still improve if they wish to be compliant. But I think also from a marketing and end user engagement perspective, it will be useful if these are published because it supports this idea of trust. And then for owners and users, I think the main benefit of the compliance toolkit would be to evaluate or find persistent identifier services that best matches their expectations and their use cases. Now, it's early days with the compliance assessment toolkit. The beta version is due at the end of November. So this is to some extent a bit of a sneak preview. But the idea then is to take that beta version to subsequent community engagement and to refine it both from an end user experience point of view and from a content point of view with inputs that we get directly from the community. But in essence, if we get down to the nitty-gritty of the toolkit, we can both view and create assessments for all of the different actors in the ecosystem. The example we're looking at here is for a persistent identifier manager. So if we want to create a new assessment, it would ask us questions about the role that we have in that actor. And it's quite important because these roles are validated by the administrators of the compliance assessment toolkit. I can't create an assessment on behalf of some actor in the ecosystem without validation. So I need to request such a role before I can create an assessment. But once that's been granted, I can create an assessment. I need to provide information about the entity or service or object that I am busy assessing. There's information about the submitter, the subject of the assessment, and then very importantly, the rights and the licensing in terms of reuse. So by default, these assessments are private, and whoever is creating and owning an assessment must make a conscious decision to publish it. Once those definitions are available, we can go and go through all of the different principles together with all of the criteria that apply to them. Many of them have multiple tests, but in this example, there is only one test. In many cases, if these tests are just yes/no questions, we require the person filling in the assessment to provide public evidence, for instance, with a URL to their website or a specification or a policy to confirm that it can be verified by third parties. And then we keep track of the extent to which the mandatory and optional criteria are being satisfied as one goes through the self-assessment. And that's as simple as it is. Eventually, one can see that by the time I have submitted this, I have passed 4 of the 5 mandatory criteria and all of the optional ones. And one can also then generate multiple assessments for the same service or object over time, and at any given time decide to publish it. So I'm going to stop there because I think that's a good enough quick overview, and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Wim. Yeah. Start. Oh, just going to flash on and off screen. Thank you so much for your presentation, Wim, and Renee as well. So yeah, we do have a couple minutes for some questions. If anyone would like to ask one, feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute your mic and have a go. I guess you were very comprehensive, Wim.
Yeah, I'm just checking through the chat if there are any questions.
Yeah. I think we mostly had that nice conversation.
Yeah, there's a question about the link to... Oh, the link has been posted. Thanks, Renee. Yeah.
Oh. Hello there. Go ahead, Rory. Rory, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah, thanks, Wim. That was, I think everyone that perhaps was not quite as up to date with what you've been doing as I am, is sitting there in stunned silence at the kind of magnitude and comprehensiveness of what you presented. This is really fantastic. So thank you very much. Do you have any thoughts on how this might evolve from what is kind of a test instance of the cat and how it could eventually become more mature and play a role in this evolving PID ecosystem?
Yes, so contractually, of course, in the Fair Core for EOSC project, the final delivery date for an operational compliance assessment toolkit that is at technology readiness level 8 in EU speak, that's only in about 18 months from now. But I'm confident that sort of towards the second half of next year, we will be in a position where this will, can be in widespread use already. The biggest challenge is not actually the software, but we are a little bit reticent to release the compliance assessment toolkit before the EOSC PID policy task force has had a chance to review the policy, maybe make improvements to the content and so on. So it's a sort of a little bit of a chicken and egg dance between us and the task force, because we're trying to assist them, of course, to take this forward. But it is a voluntary effort, and the mandates of the task force have ended, but it looks as if they will continue for a bit into next year. So let's say optimistically that by the second half of next year, we can have an updated policy. And then I think there will be no impediments to making the toolkit widely available.
Great. Can I ask a follow-up question? So then do you, what do you envision the governance of the, I realize this is just speculative, but do you know, what do you envision the governance of the, so you've got this toolkit, which looks as if it's very well thought out and will be well developed and be released in some kind of workable version at some point next year. And then do you envision that it will become, its use will be mandatory? If so, who would mandate it? What about the governance aspects?
Yeah. So implicit in the EOSC policy as it's published now is this idea of an authority that sort of verifies compliance using a tool such as the toolkit, I would say. But that's very fuzzy and undefined at the moment, and that's where the governance challenge lies. So one would hope that it is possible in let's say in the evolution of EOSC to get to a point where these kinds of governance structures can be established, because it's not only about EOSC PID policy compliance, but also about the rules of participation, of participants in EOSC, meeting certain minimum interoperability expectations. So there's quite a bit of this sort of governance and verification type things that need to happen in EOSC. But I'm not at the moment, to be honest, focused on that, although you're right in saying that it is the next logical step, is that one needs these governance infrastructures.
Great, thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions? I'm not seeing any hands. So I guess we were very clear, or as Rory mentioned, everyone's a little overwhelmed, but I guess that leads us on to the next section. So we will be taking a short break again after this to give everyone a chance to stretch their legs, grab a drink, and then we will be heading into a series of breakout rooms. The breakout rooms will be focused on 3 objects with the research workflow. So you've got publications, data sets, and software. In addition to that, they all have a range of how much they focus on the cat. So the publications breakout will be most focused on the cat, while the data set breakout will be least focused on the cat. So you can count that into your decision making as well. Basically, during the break, we will create these breakout rooms. You will get to select yourself which of the 3 you're most interested in. And then at 11:15, we will all come back and get started on those. And if you have any questions or you have any trouble accessing your breakout room or anything like that, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll try our best to get you the help you need. All right, then I wish everyone a good little break, and we'll see you guys back in the breakouts at 11:15. Thanks.